Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Library. It's wonderful to have you here. Before we begin our gentle journey into the forest tonight, I'm curious. Where in the world are you listening from? Perhaps you're nestled in bed with the curtains drawn, or maybe you're on a quiet evening walk, earbuds tucked in as the sky turns that particular shade of purple that only twilight knows. Wherever you are, I hope you're comfortable, settled, and ready to wander slowly through one of nature's most fascinating mysteries. If you find yourself enjoying these quiet explorations of science and wonder, a like and subscribe really does help this small channel find its way to others who might need a peaceful moment. And to those of you who have already subscribed, thank you. Truly, your presence here means more than you might realize. Now, tonight we're going to talk about trees, but not in the way you might expect. We're not here to catalogue species or measure growth rings, though those things have their own quiet beauty. Instead, we're going to explore something that sounds almost like fiction, something that would have seemed impossible just a few decades ago. We're going to discover how trees talk to each other. I'll try not to make it so fascinating that you stay wide awake, though I can't make any promises. Sometimes the most soothing truths are also the most astonishing. So, let's begin, shall we? Let's step softly into the forest and listen to what the trees have been saying all along. When you think of a forest, what comes to mind? Perhaps towering trunks reaching towards scattered sunlight, the rustle of leaves in a breeze that smells of earth and moisture, the particular hush that seems to wrap around you when you step beneath the canopy, as though the world outside has grown suddenly distant. For most of human history, we've thought of trees as solitary beings, rooted in place, competing silently for sunlight and water, living and growing in splendid isolation. Each tree was imagined as its own separate story, its own struggle for survival. We saw forests as collections of individuals, standing side by side but fundamentally alone. This understanding made a certain kind of sense. After all, trees don't move. They don't call out or reach for one another in ways we can easily see. When we walk through a forest, we see distinct trunks, separate crowns of leaves, individual organisms clearly marked by the space between them. But, in recent decades, scientists have discovered something extraordinary, something that changes how we understand not just forests, but connection itself. It turns out that beneath our feet, hidden in the dark soil, trees are engaged in constant conversation. They're sharing resources, sending warnings, supporting their young, and even recognizing their relatives. The forest, it seems, is not a collection of strangers, but a community, a network. Some researchers have taken to calling it the Wood Wide Web, and for good reason. This discovery didn't happen overnight. It emerged slowly, piece by patient piece, as scientists learned to look beneath the surface, to trace invisible pathways, to listen to chemical whispers that had been there all along, waiting to be heard. The story of how we learned that trees communicate begins, as many scientific stories do, with someone willing to look at the world in a slightly different way. In this case, that someone was a young researcher named Suzanne Simard, working in the forests of British Columbia in the 1990s. Simard grew up surrounded by trees. Her family had worked in forestry for generations, and she understood forests not as abstract ecosystems, but as living places, complex and interconnected. But even with this intimate knowledge, what she would discover still surprised her. At the time, forest management practices often treated trees as crops, to be harvested and replanted in neat, efficient rows. Clear-cutting was common, followed by replanting with commercially valuable species like Douglas fir. But something puzzling kept happening. These planted trees often struggled. They grew slowly, weakened, and were more susceptible to pests and environmental stress than trees growing in natural, undisturbed forests. Simard wondered why. What was missing from these artificial plantations that natural forests provided? The answer, she would discover, was connection. She began her groundbreaking research by asking a deceptively simple question. Do trees share resources with each other? To find out, she designed an elegant experiment. She took tree seedlings, Douglas fir and paper birch, common neighbors in British Columbia's forests, and she gave them special food. Not regular nutrients, but carbon tagged with radioactive isotopes, traces that could be followed as they moved through the trees. Then she waited and watched. And what she saw changed everything. The carbon didn't stay in the trees where she'd placed it. Instead, it traveled. It moved underground, through the soil, and appeared in neighboring trees of different species. The Douglas fir was sharing with the birch. The birch was sharing with the fir. Back and forth, a quiet exchange happening entirely out of sight. But how? Trees don't have veins connecting to each other. Their roots, while they may grow near one another, don't typically fuse into shared systems. So how was carbon, the very building block of tree growth, moving from one individual to another? The answer lay in something that had been hiding in plain sight, or rather, hiding just beneath it. The answer was fungi. If you've ever walked through a forest after rain and noticed mushrooms sprouting from the soil, you've seen the visible part of a much larger organism. Mushrooms are merely the fruiting bodies, the reproductive structures of fungi. The bulk of the fungal organism lives underground, as a sprawling network of thread-like structures called hyphae. These hyphae are impossibly thin, finer than the finest roots, and they spread through the soil like an intricate web. A single teaspoon of forest soil can contain several miles of these fungal threads, winding through particles of earth, wrapping around minerals, connecting to roots. And it's at the roots where the story gets truly interesting. Many fungi have evolved a remarkable relationship with trees. The fungal threads wrap around and sometimes even penetrate tree roots, forming structures called mycorrhizae, from the Greek words myces, meaning fungus, and rhiza, meaning root, fungus root. A partnership so ancient and so fundamental that most of the plants on Earth depend on it. This relationship is what scientists call mutualistic. Both partners benefit. The tree produces sugar through photosynthesis, converting sunlight into energy-rich carbon compounds in its leaves. Some of this sugar travels down through the tree and into the roots, where it's shared with the fungus. In return, the fungus acts as an extension of the tree's root system, spreading farther than the tree's roots ever could, exploring tiny pockets and crevices in the soil, accessing water and minerals like nitrogen and phosphorus, and delivering these essential nutrients back to the tree. It's an elegant exchange. The tree provides food. The fungus provides access to resources the tree couldn't reach alone. But here's where it becomes extraordinary. One fungus doesn't connect to just one tree. These underground networks link multiple trees together, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, creating a vast web of connection beneath the forest floor. This is what Suzanne Simard discovered. The carbon moving between her experimental trees was traveling through these fungal highways. The Douglas fir was feeding sugar to the fungus, which was then shuttling some of that sugar to the paper birch. The network was acting as a living conduit, a biological internet, transferring resources and information across the forest. When Simard published her findings in the journal Nature in 1997, it sent ripples through the scientific community. The idea that trees of different species were sharing resources, were connected in this intimate way, challenged fundamental assumptions about how forests worked. But, as is often the case with groundbreaking discoveries, this was just the beginning. Other researchers began to explore these mycorrhizal networks, and with each study, the story grew richer and more complex. They discovered that these networks weren't just transferring carbon, they were moving nitrogen, phosphorus, water, and even more subtle signals. Chemical compounds that could warn of danger, hormonal messages that could trigger changes in neighboring trees. The fungal threads were acting not just as supply lines, but as communication cables. Imagine it this way. If you could shrink down and see the forest from beneath the soil, you'd witness a landscape utterly transformed. Instead of isolated trees, you'd see a web of glowing connections, pulsing with exchanges. Resources flowing from sunlit trees to shaded ones, warnings spreading from those under attack to those still safe. A community in constant, quiet conversation. The more scientists studied these networks, the more sophisticated they appeared. They found that the networks had structure, that some trees were more connected than others, acting as hubs in the system. Simard called these highly connected trees mother trees. They're typically the largest, oldest trees in the forest, with deep root systems and extensive fungal partnerships built up over decades or even centuries. And these mother trees do something remarkable. They don't just connect to the network, they seem to use it to nurture younger trees. Research has shown that when seedlings establish near a mother tree, they often receive a disproportionate amount of resources through the network. The larger tree appears to be subsidizing the growth of the younger ones, providing them with sugar, nutrients, and even defensive compounds that help them survive. Even more surprisingly, some studies suggest that mother trees may recognize their own offspring and preferentially support them. When researchers have analyzed the flow of resources through mycorrhizal networks, they found patterns suggesting that related trees grown from seeds from the same parent, receive more support than unrelated individuals. This hints at something profound. Not consciousness, not intention in the way we understand it, but a kind of biological recognition, a sensitivity to chemical signatures that allows trees to distinguish kin from non-kin. The mechanisms are still being studied, but the implications are staggering. The forest may have a memory, a way of knowing at a chemical level who belongs to whom. Of course, not everyone in the scientific community embraced these findings immediately. Some researchers questioned the interpretations, pointing out that the experiments were complex and the results sometimes ambiguous. Could the carbon transfer be explained by simpler mechanisms? Were the fungi merely following gradients of concentration, moving resources from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity, without any active management by the trees? These are fair questions, and the scientific debate continues. But even the skeptics acknowledge that mycorrhizal networks exist, that they're widespread, and that they do facilitate resource transfer. The question isn't whether trees are connected, it's how actively they manage these connections, and what that means for how we understand forests. What we know for certain is this: the forest floor is threaded with a vast, living network of fungal filaments. These filaments connect trees across remarkable distances. Resources and chemical signals move through these connections, and the presence or absence of this network dramatically affects the health and survival of individual trees. In experiments, where researchers have deliberately severed these connections by blocking fungal growth or removing soil around roots, the affected trees have suffered. They've grown more slowly, been more vulnerable to stress, and shown reduced ability to recover from damage. The network, it seems, provides resilience. There's something deeply beautiful about this, don't you think? The idea that strength comes not from standing alone, but from connection. That survival is enhanced through sharing rather than hoarding. That the oldest, most successful members of the community invest in the youngest, ensuring the future even as they themselves age. It's easy to romanticize these findings, to project human emotions and motivations onto the trees. We must be careful not to do that. Trees don't think or feel in the way we do. They have no brains, no nervous systems, no capacity for conscious decision-making as we understand it. But they do respond to their environment in sophisticated ways. They sense changes in light, temperature, moisture, and chemical composition. They adjust their growth, their defenses, their resource allocation based on these sensory inputs. And through the mycorrhizal network, they respond not just to their immediate surroundings, but to the state of their neighbors. This is a different kind of intelligence, if we want to use that word. Not the intelligence of thought and planning, but the intelligence of adaptation and response. The intelligence that evolution crafts over millions of years, encoding survival strategies into chemical pathways and cellular processes. The mycorrhizal network is just one of the ways trees communicate. There's another pathway, equally fascinating, that happens not beneath the ground, but through the air. On a warm summer day, walk into a forest and breathe deeply. That smell, that particular green, living scent, is not just the smell of plants and soil, it's the smell of chemistry. More specifically, it's the smell of volatile organic compounds, chemicals that trees release into the air. These compounds serve many purposes. Some attract pollinators to flowers. Some help regulate temperature around the leaf surface. But some, scientists have discovered, carry messages. When a tree is wounded, perhaps by insects chewing on its leaves or by physical damage to its bark, it releases specific volatile compounds. These chemicals drift on the breeze, spreading through the forest. And when they reach neighboring trees, something remarkable happens. Those undamaged trees begin to change their chemistry. They start producing defensive compounds, bitter tannins, and toxic alkaloids that make their leaves less palatable to herbivores. They're preparing for an attack that hasn't happened yet, warned by the chemical distress call of their neighbor. This phenomenon was first observed in African acacia trees in the 1980s. Researchers noticed something strange. When giraffes began feeding on one acacia tree, the near trees would suddenly become less palatable, even though the giraffes hadn't touched them yet. It was as if the forest was defending itself collectively. Further research revealed the mechanism. The acacia tree being eaten would release ethylene gas. This gas would be detected by nearby trees, triggering them to pump tannins into their leaves, making them bitter and difficult to digest. The giraffes, finding the vegetation suddenly unappetizing, would move on, limiting the damage to any single tree. Similar warning systems have since been found in many other species. Pines release volatile compounds when attacked by bark beetles. Birches signal when being defoliated by caterpillars. Oaks communicate when infected by certain fungi. The forest is full of these chemical conversations, warnings spreading from tree to tree faster than any insect infestation could travel. The compounds involved are diverse and specific. There are simple molecules like methyl jasmonate, a hormonal signal that triggers broad defensive responses. There are complex terpenes, volatile oils that can carry information about the specific type of threat. There are green leaf volatiles, the fresh-cut grass smell that signals physical damage. Trees can even distinguish between different threats based on the chemical messages they receive. An aerial attack by leaf-eating caterpillars produces a different volatile signature than root damage from beetle larvae. Neighboring trees, detecting these nuanced signals, can tailor their defensive responses appropriately. What's perhaps most surprising is the distance over which these airborne signals can travel. In controlled experiments, researchers have found that trees downwind from a damaged individual can detect warning signals and begin their defensive preparations even when they're dozens of meters away. The forest warning system has range. But airborne signals have limitations. Wind can disperse them quickly, carrying messages away from where they're needed, or diluting them below the threshold of detection. Weather affects their transmission, humidity and temperature changing how far and how effectively these chemical messages travel. And chemicals in the air can degrade over time, broken down by sunlight and reacting with other atmospheric compounds. This is where the underground fungal network becomes important again. While airborne signals are fast but fleeting, signals sent through the mycorrhizal network are slower but more reliable. They're not subject to weather. They travel through protected pathways directly from root to root. They can convey more complex information. Recent research has revealed that some of the same warning compounds that trees release into the air can also be transmitted through the fungal network. When a tree is under attack, it may send chemical signals both ways, up into the atmosphere as a rapid, broad warning, and down into the soil as a more targeted, persistent alert to its directly connected neighbors. The fungal network can carry an astonishing variety of signals. Studies have detected the movement of jasmonic acid, a plant hormone involved in wound response and defense activation. They've tracked salicylic acid, which plays a role in disease resistance. They've followed various terpenes and phenolic compounds, each carrying its own meaning in the chemical language of the forest. Even more intriguingly, researchers have found evidence that electrical signals can travel through the mycorrhizal network. Yes, electrical signals, much like the nerve impulses in animals, though vastly slower. Plants generate electrical potentials across their cell membranes. When they're stimulated, by touch, by damage, by changes in their environment, these electrical states can shift, creating waves of electrical activity that propagate through the plant's tissues. These aren't fast like animal nerve impulses. They travel at speeds measured in millimeters per second, rather than meters per second. But they travel nonetheless, carrying information about stress and stimulation from one part of the plant to another. What scientists have discovered in recent years is that these electrical signals don't stop at the plant's roots. They can extend into the fungal network, traveling along the fungal hyphae to neighboring plants. The fungi, it seems, can conduct not just chemicals, but electrical impulses. In laboratory studies, researchers have electrically stimulated one plant and then measured electrical responses in completely separate plants connected by the same fungal network. The signals were weak but detectable, and importantly, they occurred within minutes, far too quickly to be explained by chemical diffusion alone. The function of these electrical signals in nature is still being explored. They may serve as rapid alerts, faster than chemical signals, providing an early warning system. They may help coordinate responses across the network, synchronizing defensive preparations. They may even play a role in maintaining the network itself, the electrical activity perhaps influencing fungal growth and behavior. What's becoming clear is that the forest communication system is multi-layered and redundant. Chemical signals through the air for rapid, broad alerts. Chemical signals through the soil for reliable, targeted information. Electrical signals for fast coordination. And all of these operating simultaneously, creating a rich, complex flow of information that keeps the forest functioning as an integrated system. Let's pause for a moment and consider what all this means. We've discovered that trees are connected by an underground network of fungi, that they share resources through this network, supporting each other's growth and survival, that they send warnings of danger through both air and soil, that they can even transmit electrical signals, that older trees appear to nurture younger ones, that there's evidence of kin recognition, and preferential treatment of relatives. Taken together, these findings suggest something that seems almost radical. The forest is not a battlefield where individual trees compete ruthlessly until the strongest prevail. Instead, it's closer to a community, or perhaps even a superorganism, where the success of individuals is tied to the health of the whole. This doesn't mean there's no competition in forests. There absolutely is. Trees still vie for sunlight, still spread their roots to capture water and nutrients, still employ strategies to outgrow their neighbors. Competition and cooperation exist side by side, intertwined, each playing its role in shaping the forest. But the balance is different from what we once thought. The most successful trees aren't necessarily the tallest or the fastest growing. They're often the most connected, the ones with the richest fungal partnerships, the ones that can both give and receive through the network. And this has profound implications for how we think about forest health and management. For decades, forestry practices have focused on maximizing the growth of commercially valuable species, often by planting them in monocultures, in neat rows, without the diversity of a natural forest. These plantations are efficient in some ways, easy to plant and harvest, but they lack the mycorrhizal diversity and complexity of natural forests. They lack the network. Trees in plantations often grow faster initially, when they're young and the soil is fresh and nutrients are abundant. But over time, they can become more vulnerable, more susceptible to disease, more likely to suffer in drought or extreme weather, less resilient. They're missing the support system that natural forests provide. Research by Suzanne Simard and others has shown that maintaining diversity in forests, including the fungi, not just the trees, enhances overall forest health. Mixed forests with multiple tree species support more diverse fungal communities, which creates a more robust network, which in turn supports the trees better. This is partly because different tree species tend to associate with different types of fungi. Douglas firs, for example, typically form relationships with ectomycorrhizal fungi, species that wrap around the outside of root cells. Birches and alders often work with both ectomycorrhizal fungi and another type called arbuscular mycorrhizae, which actually penetrate into root cells. When multiple tree species grow together, they bring their fungal partners with them, creating a more diverse underground ecosystem. And this diversity means more pathways for connection, more potential routes for resources and signals to travel, more resilience if one pathway is disrupted. It's worth noting that mycorrhizal networks aren't always beneficial to all parties. The forest, like any community, has its conflicts and its freeloaders. Some plants have evolved to be what scientists call mycoheterotrophs. They don't photosynthesize, or barely do. Instead, they tap into the mycorrhizal network and steal resources from other plants. Orchids are famous for this. Many orchid species, especially in their early growth stages, are essentially parasites, drawing all their carbon from the fungal network without contributing anything in return. Even among photosynthesizing trees, there can be winners and losers in the network game. Some trees are better at manipulating the fungi, at ensuring they receive more than they give. Some are more effective at blocking resources from reaching competitors. And some plants use the network not to share nutrients, but to wage chemical warfare. They release allelopathic compounds, toxins that travel through the soil and through fungal connections to inhibit the growth of nearby competitors. The network that can be used for cooperation can also be weaponized for competition. This complexity is important to acknowledge. The forest isn't a utopia of perfect harmony and selfless sharing. It's a dynamic system where cooperation and competition coexist, where relationships can shift from beneficial to exploitative depending on conditions, where individual survival strategies play out against the backdrop of community interdependence. But even acknowledging this complexity, the overall pattern is clear. Connection enhances survival. Trees that are well networked tend to be healthier, more resilient, longer lived. Forests with intact mycorrhizal networks recover better from disturbances, resist invasive species more effectively, and sequester more carbon. This brings us to one of the most poignant aspects of tree communication. What happens when a tree faces its end? Trees can live for a very long time, centuries, sometimes millennia. But eventually, every tree must transition. Perhaps it's damaged by storm or fire. Perhaps it's overcome by disease. Perhaps it's simply old, its ability to photosynthesize declining as its canopy thins and its leaves turn less efficiently toward the sun. What researchers have observed is that when trees begin to decline, they often increase their export of resources through the mycorrhizal network. Sugar, nitrogen, phosphorus, defensive compounds, all flowing out from the fading tree to its neighbors. In one particularly touching example, scientists studying old beech forests found ancient stumps, trees cut down hundreds of years ago, still alive. Not growing, not producing leaves, but alive, their sapwood still containing living cells. How? The surrounding trees, connected by the mycorrhizal network, were keeping them alive, pumping sugar and nutrients into the old stumps, maintaining them long past the point where they could support themselves. Why would trees do this? The pragmatic explanation is that maintaining the fungal network benefits everyone. Dead or dying trees still host fungi, still provide connection pathways. By keeping even a stump alive, the community maintains the integrity of the network. But there's something almost elegiac about it, isn't there? The idea that even in the end, when a tree can no longer contribute to the forest's photosynthesis, the community doesn't abandon it. The connections remain, the sharing continues. The old tree, or what's left of it, is held by the forest that it once helped sustain. Of course, this is where we must be most careful not to anthropomorphize. Trees don't have emotions. They don't care about each other in the way we care about our friends and family. These are chemical processes, evolved responses, not conscious choices. And yet, there's something profound in recognizing that evolution has favored cooperation, that the strategies which have persisted and spread are ones that involve sharing and support, that the most successful forests are the most interconnected ones. Perhaps what we're seeing in trees is a different model of intelligence entirely. Not the intelligence of individual problem solving, but the intelligence of networks, of distributed processing, of communities responding to their environment as a collective whole. Scientists studying these systems sometimes use the language of neural networks, drawing parallels between the structure of mycorrhizal networks and the structure of brains. Both involve nodes, points of high connectivity, hubs that link to many other points. Both show what's called small world properties, where signals can travel efficiently from any point to any other point through a relatively small number of steps. Both demonstrate resilience, the ability to maintain function even when individual connections are lost. The comparison has limits. Fungal networks don't process information the way brains do. They don't generate consciousness or experience. But they do integrate signals from across the forest. They do coordinate responses. They do, in some sense, remember, because the structure of the network itself is shaped by the history of connections and exchanges. A mature forest's mycorrhizal network is the product of decades or centuries of growth, of fungal species establishing and competing and cooperating, of trees forming partnerships and maintaining them over time. This network encodes, in its very structure, a kind of ecological memory. Which paths carry resources most efficiently? Which trees are the major hubs? Which areas of the forest are under stress and which are thriving? When this network is disrupted by clear-cutting, by soil disturbance, by pollution that affects soil chemistry, that memory is lost. The forest must rebuild, must re-establish connections, must relearn, in a sense, how to function as an integrated system. This can take decades. This is one reason why old-growth forests are so precious and so irreplaceable. It's not just the age of the individual trees, though that matters. It's the age of the connections, the maturity of the mycorrhizal network, the accumulated ecological memory encoded in the underground web. When we protect old-growth forests, we're protecting not just trees but systems, not just individuals but communities, not just organisms but the relationships between them. And this understanding is beginning to change how we approach forest conservation and restoration. Instead of focusing solely on replanting trees, forward-thinking forestry now considers the soil, the fungi, the network. Projects that preserve soil integrity, that inoculate young trees with mycorrhizal fungi from healthy forests, that maintain diversity and complexity. These approaches recognize that growing a forest is about more than just growing trees. The research on tree communication has also sparked broader questions about plant intelligence and consciousness. If trees can sense their environment, respond to threats, communicate with each other, recognize relatives, and nurture their young, do they in some sense know what they're doing? This is a question that philosophers and scientists continue to debate. The consensus is that trees almost certainly don't have subjective experiences, don't have the kind of consciousness that involves awareness and feeling. They lack the neurological structures that, as far as we know, generate such experiences. But they do have agency, in a sense. They make choices, chemical choices, about where to allocate resources, when to grow, when to defend, when to release seeds. These aren't conscious choices, but they're not purely mechanical either. They're informed by sensory input, by the tree's state, by signals from the environment and from other trees. Some scientists have proposed the term plant neurobiology to study how plants integrate information and coordinate responses without a brain. Others object to the terminology, arguing that it misleadingly implies similarity to animal nervous systems, when the underlying mechanisms are entirely different. Perhaps the terminology doesn't matter as much as the recognition that plants, and particularly trees, are far more sophisticated than we once believed. They're not passive, not simply responding mechanically to their immediate surroundings. They're actively sensing, signaling, adjusting, participating in a complex web of interactions that shapes their survival and that of their community. And for us, as humans, there's something deeply moving in this revelation. We've always known on some intuitive level that forests are special places, that there's something calming, almost healing, about walking among trees. Now we're beginning to understand that forests are not just collections of individual organisms, but living, interconnected systems, communities engaged in constant, invisible conversation. When you stand in a forest, you're standing within this network. Beneath your feet, right now, resources are being shared. Warnings are being transmitted. Nutrients are flowing from old trees to young ones, from strong to weak, from sunlight to shade. The fungi are weaving their threads through the soil, connecting root to root, creating pathways, facilitating exchanges. And through the air, invisible to our eyes, but detectable with the right instruments, chemical messages are passing from tree to tree, a fragrant vocabulary of defense and distress and seasonal change. We're only beginning to understand the full complexity of these systems. Each year brings new discoveries, new insights into the chemical and physical mechanisms underlying tree communication. We're learning how pH affects signal transmission through soil, how temperature influences fungal growth and network structure, how different tree species have different communication strategies, different strengths and weaknesses in their networking abilities. We're discovering that the age of a forest matters tremendously, not just because old trees are large and stable, but because older forests have had more time to develop their mycorrhizal networks, more time to establish the connections that allow for efficient resource sharing and communication. We're finding that disturbance history affects network function, that forests recovering from fire or logging develop different network structures than those that have remained undisturbed, and that these differences persist for decades, influencing everything from drought resistance to carbon sequestration. We're realizing that mycorrhizal networks don't just connect trees within a forest patch, but can extend across landscapes, linking forest fragments, creating corridors of connection through areas otherwise dominated by non-forest vegetation. These extended networks may be crucial for forest resilience in fragmented landscapes, allowing isolated tree populations to remain connected and exchange resources and genetic material via seed dispersal facilitated by the fungi. As climate patterns shift and forests face new stresses, droughts more severe, storms more intense, pests and diseases expanding into new ranges, the question of forest resilience becomes increasingly urgent. And the research on tree communication suggests that preserving and restoring the mycorrhizal networks should be a central focus of conservation efforts. A tree alone, however strong, is vulnerable. A connected tree, supported by and supporting a network of neighbors and their fungal partners, is far more resilient. A forest with an intact, mature mycorrhizal network can buffer individual trees against stress, can redistribute resources to where they're most needed, can coordinate responses to threats, and can maintain function even when parts of the system are damaged. This is not just poetic metaphor. This is measurable, quantifiable biology with real implications for how forests respond to environmental change. Studies have shown that trees connected to mycorrhizal networks recover more quickly from drought stress than isolated trees. They maintain higher water content in their tissues because the network redistributes water from areas where it's more available to areas where it's scarce. They show less cellular damage because they receive defensive compounds and signaling molecules that help them prepare for and respond to water stress. Similarly, trees connected to networks show enhanced resistance to insect attacks, not only because they receive early warning signals, but because the network allows them to maintain better overall health, and healthy trees are simply more resistant to pests and disease than stressed ones. The network also affects how forests sequester carbon, one of their most important functions in the context of climate change. Trees pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into wood and leaves and roots. But they also transfer carbon underground, to their roots and to the fungi. The mycorrhizal network is a massive carbon sink in its own right, with carbon from trees being stored in fungal tissues and eventually in soil organic matter. Intact mycorrhizal networks enhance this carbon sequestration. They keep carbon cycling through the forest ecosystem, locked in living biomass and soil, rather than being rapidly returned to the atmosphere through decomposition. They allow forests to function as more effective carbon sinks, helping to mitigate climate change. All of this research is painting a picture of forests as far more than the sum of their individual trees. The forest is the trees, yes, but it's also the fungi, the bacteria, the insects, the mammals and birds, all woven together in countless relationships, many of them invisible, many of them only recently discovered. And at the heart of this system, literally at its roots, is communication. The sharing of resources and information that allows the forest to function not as a random collection of competing organisms, but as a coordinated, resilient, adaptive community. As we learn more about how trees communicate, we're also learning perhaps something about ourselves, about the importance of connection, about how systems, whether forests or societies, thrive not through competition alone, but through networks of mutual support. About how the strongest communities are those where resources flow to where they're needed, where warnings are shared, where the successful support the struggling. These are not new ideas, of course. Humans have always known that we're stronger together, that community matters, that isolation is a form of vulnerability. But seeing these principles reflected in the natural world, in systems that evolved over millions of years, gives them a different kind of weight. They're not just human constructions or cultural values. They're evolutionary strategies, patterns that arise again and again in successful systems. The trees have been practicing mutual aid for far longer than we've had words for it. The fungal networks have been facilitating resource sharing since before the first forests colonized land. These aren't conscious choices, but they're choices. Nonetheless, encoded in chemistry and structure, tested and refined across countless generations. And now, we're privileged to witness these networks, to trace their pathways, to begin to understand their language. We're learning to read the chemical signals, to map the fungal highways, to appreciate the intricate choreography of give and take that keeps forests alive and healthy. It's a humbling realization. For so long, we saw forests as resources to be exploited, as timber and land waiting to be used. We're learning, slowly, to see them as communities to be respected, as systems whose complexity we're only beginning to grasp, as partners in maintaining the health of the planet. The trees have always been talking. We're only now learning to listen. There's another dimension to tree communication that feels almost magical, though it's rooted in physics just as firmly as any other aspect we've discussed. Trees, it turns out, might also communicate through sound. Not sound as we typically think of it, human voices or birdsong, but vibrations. Mechanical waves traveling through wood and soil, carrying information in ways we're only beginning to understand. When you place your hand against the trunk of a tree, you might feel stillness, solid wood, unmoving, quiet. But if you could sense at a different scale, if your perception extended into frequencies beyond human hearing, you'd discover that the tree is anything but silent. It hums with activity. Water moving through xylem vessels creates pressure changes. Air bubbles, forming and collapsing during drought stress, generate ultrasonic clicks. Roots growing through soil produce low-frequency vibrations. The tree is a living instrument, constantly creating sound. Whether these sounds serve a communicative function is still a matter of scientific investigation and some debate. But the evidence is intriguing. Studies have shown that plant roots can detect specific frequencies of sound and will grow towards sources that emit vibrations around 200 to 220 Hz. This frequency range is particularly interesting because it's also the range at which researchers have detected clicks emanating from growing roots themselves. In one elegant experiment, researchers suspended corn seedlings in water and measured both the sounds the roots produced and how the roots responded to external sound sources. The roots generated frequent clicking noises, quiet but measurable, concentrated around that 220 Hz frequency. When the researchers played sounds at similar frequencies near the roots bent toward the sound source, as if listening, as if following some acoustic beacon. The implications are fascinating. Could trees be using sound to locate water in the soil? Water moving through porous earth creates vibrations, subtle but potentially detectable. If roots can sense these vibrations and grow toward them, it would provide an additional tool for finding resources, complementing the chemical gradients they do already follow. Could they be using sound to detect neighbors? Growing roots create vibrations as they push through soil. If nearby plants can detect these vibrations, they might adjust their own root growth, avoiding competition or, in some cases, growing toward potential partners for mycorrhizal connections. Could sound even travel through the mycorrhizal networks themselves? Fungal hyphae, those thin threads connecting tree to tree, are essentially biological cables. They conduct chemicals and electrical signals. Could they also conduct vibrations? Could a tree send not just chemical warnings through the network, but acoustic ones as well? This is speculative at this point. The research is in its early stages, and many scientists remain cautious about drawing conclusions. The mechanisms by which plants might generate and detect sounds are still poorly understood. Plants don't have ears or any obvious sound-detecting organs. How they might transduce vibrations into biological signals remains a question. But plants are mechanosensitive. They respond to touch, to wind, to the slightest physical perturbation. Specialized proteins in their cell membranes can detect mechanical deformation and convert it into chemical signals, calcium waves and electrical impulses that spread through the plant. It's not implausible that vibrations at specific frequencies could activate these same mechanosensing systems. What we do know is that plants respond to sound in measurable ways. Experiments have shown that certain frequencies can enhance germination rates, accelerate growth, or even strengthen plant defenses. In some studies, plants exposed to music or specific sound frequencies grew faster and healthier than control plants raised in silence. These effects could have practical applications. In China, researchers have explored using sound waves as an agricultural tool, broadcasting specific frequencies over crop fields to enhance yield. The science is still developing, but early results are promising enough to warrant continued investigation. And there's something poetic about it, isn't there? The idea that forests might be full of sound we can't hear, that beneath the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches in the wind, there's another acoustic layer, ultrasonic clicks and subsonic rumbles, trees calling out in frequencies beyond our perception. It reminds us, once again, that our human-centered view of the world is limited. We experience reality through our particular sensory apparatus, 5 senses tuned to detect the wavelengths and frequencies and chemical compounds relevant to human survival. But that's not the only way to experience the world. Other organisms, with different sensory structures, inhabit different sensory universes. Bats navigate by echolocation, perceiving space through the echoes of their high-pitched calls. Bees see ultraviolet patterns on flowers invisible to human eyes. Sharks detect electric fields generated by the muscle contractions of prey. And trees? Trees might exist in a world of slow electrical pulses, subtle chemical gradients, and vibrations traveling through wood and earth. A sensory landscape entirely alien to us, but no less real for that alienness. As we continue to study tree communication, we're also learning about the rhythms of forests, the patterns that repeat across seasons and years. When autumn arrives and the days grow shorter, deciduous trees begin their annual transformation. Leaves shift from green to brilliant gold and red and orange, a final display before they fall. This is a period of change, of preparation, and of communication. As a tree prepares for winter dormancy, it begins to withdraw resources from its leaves. Nitrogen, phosphorus, valuable nutrients are transported back into the trunk and roots, stored for the winter, saved for the burst of growth that will come in spring. The green chlorophyll breaks down, revealing the other pigments that were there all along, hidden beneath the green. Yellows from carotenoids, reds from anthocyanins. The autumn colors we find so beautiful are, in a sense, a kind of unmasking, showing us compounds that served different purposes while the tree was actively growing. Eventually, the connection between leaf and branch weakens. A specialized layer of cells, the abscission zone, develops at the base of each leaf stem. These cells separate, breaking the physical and chemical connections. The leaf falls, and the tree seals the wound, protecting itself from water loss and infection. But the tree doesn't cease all activity. Even as it sheds its leaves and appears to sleep, internal processes continue. The tree is alive, metabolizing slowly, maintaining its living tissues, monitoring its environment. And it remains connected to the mycorrhizal network. Winter, in some ways, is when the underground network becomes most important. With no leaves to photosynthesize, deciduous trees can't produce their own sugar. They rely on stored reserves in their roots and trunk. But they're not entirely isolated. The network remains active, and evergreen trees, still photosynthesizing through the winter months, continue to share resources through the fungal connections. Research has shown that carbon continues to flow through mycorrhizal networks even in winter, though at reduced rates. The evergreens, with their needles still functioning, still producing sugar, subsidize their deciduous neighbors. And in spring, when the deciduous trees leaf out early, before the evergreen needles fully ramp up their activity, the flow reverses. The deciduous trees return the favor, sharing their abundant spring sugar production with the evergreens. This seasonal back and forth, this reciprocal exchange, is one of the most elegant examples of how the forest functions as an integrated system. Different species with different strategies, complementing each other across the year. Neither could thrive as well alone as they do together, connected through the underground network. The triggers for spring awakening are complex. Temperature plays a role, but so does photoperiod, the length of daylight. Trees don't just respond to whether it's warm or cold. They track how the warmth changes over time, how the day length shifts. They're essentially counting, accumulating signals until a threshold is reached, and then they respond, buds swelling, leaves unfurling, growth resuming. This sensitivity to multiple environmental cues helps protect trees from being fooled by unseasonable warmth. A few warm days in late winter aren't enough to trigger bud break. The tree needs consistent signals, a pattern that indicates winter is truly over, not just experiencing a temporary thaw. It's a strategy honed over millennia, a way of minimizing the risk of frost damage to vulnerable new growth. And as the trees wake, as sap begins to flow and buds prepare to open, the activity in the mycorrhizal network increases as well. Fungi that were dormant or minimally active through the winter begin to grow again, extending their hyphal networks, reconnecting trees, facilitating the exchanges that will support the new growing season. The forest comes alive not all at once, but in stages, in layers, each part responding to its particular cues, but all parts ultimately connected. The timing of one influencing the timing of others through the network of communication and resource sharing. We might think of spring in a forest as a kind of awakening, trees opening their eyes after a long sleep, but perhaps it's better to think of it as a reconnection, a renewal of conversations that quieted but never fully stopped. The trees have been listening all along, monitoring conditions, preparing. Now they speak again, more loudly, more actively, sending new signals, new resources, participating once more in the full complexity of forest life. The more we learn about tree communication, the more we understand that the forest is not a static place, but a dynamic, responsive, adaptive system. And this understanding is particularly relevant now, as forests face unprecedented challenges from climate change. Temperature patterns are shifting. Growing seasons are lengthening in some areas, becoming more erratic in others. Precipitation patterns are changing, with more intense droughts and more severe storms. The carefully calibrated timing that trees rely on, the environmental cues that tell them when to bud, when to grow, when to prepare for winter, these cues are becoming less reliable. A tree that has evolved to respond to a particular photoperiod and temperature pattern may find itself waking too early, before the danger of frost has passed, or too late, missing optimal growing conditions. The relationship between deciduous and evergreen trees in a mixed forest, the seasonal exchange through mycorrhizal networks, may be disrupted if the two groups fall out of synchrony. And yet, forests are remarkably resilient. The communication networks we've been discussing, the mycorrhizal connections, the chemical signaling, the resource sharing, all of these contribute to that resilience. When a drought hits, trees connected to a healthy network can receive water and nutrients from less stressed neighbors, helping them survive. When diseases strike, warning signals can spread through the network, allowing trees to prepare their defenses before they're directly infected. When individual trees are damaged, the community can rally, redistributing resources to compensate. This doesn't mean forests are invulnerable to climate change. They're not. But it does mean that intact forests, with their communication networks functioning, are better equipped to adapt than we might have expected when we thought of forests as collections of competing individuals. Conservation efforts are beginning to reflect this understanding. Instead of focusing solely on preserving individual trees or even individual species, there's growing recognition of the importance of preserving forest systems, the relationships and networks that make forests more than just groups of trees. This means protecting soil health and the fungal communities in that soil. It means maintaining habitat connectivity so that genetic material and fungal spores can move between forest patches. It means thinking carefully about logging practices, ensuring that mother trees and hub trees are preserved to maintain network integrity when other trees are harvested. Some forestry operations are experimenting with new approaches inspired by this research. Instead of clear-cutting, they're using selective harvesting that maintains canopy closure and minimizes soil disturbance. They're leaving intact corridors where old growth characteristics can persist. They're even inoculating replanted seedlings with mycorrhizal fungi from healthy forests, giving the young trees a head start in establishing their connections. It's still early days for these practices, and there's much debate about how best to balance human needs for forest resources with the need to maintain forest health and function. But the conversation is shifting. The recognition that forests are interconnected systems, not just timber resources, is increasingly influencing how we think about forest management and conservation. And this shift in thinking extends beyond forestry. Urban planners are beginning to consider tree communication networks when designing parks and green spaces. Instead of isolated street trees in small pits of compacted soil, there's growing interest in creating connected soil volumes, areas where tree roots and mycorrhizal fungi can spread and link together, creating mini networks even in cities. The benefits could be substantial. Connected urban trees are healthier, more resistant to pests and diseases, better able to provide ecosystem services like air filtration and temperature regulation. They create cooler microclimates in city neighborhoods. They improve mental health for residents who interact with them, and they sequester more carbon, contributing to climate change mitigation. All of this from taking seriously the idea that trees communicate, that they need connection, that they're stronger together. It's worth pausing to appreciate how recent this understanding is. Suzanne Simard published her groundbreaking work on mycorrhizal networks in 1997, less than 30 years ago. The study of plant bioacoustics, of trees and sound, is even younger, with most research emerging in the last decade or so. We're in the early stages of understanding tree communication. Each study opens new questions. Each answer reveals new mysteries. There's so much we still don't know. How do trees decide when to share resources and when to withhold them? What determines the strength and persistence of mycorrhizal connections? Can trees learn and adapt their communication strategies based on past experiences? How much does tree communication vary between species, between ecosystems, between regions? These questions will keep researchers occupied for decades. And as new technologies emerge, laser vibrometers to detect plant sounds, advanced chemical sensors to track volatile compounds, machine learning algorithms to analyze network patterns, will undoubtedly make discoveries that surprise us, that challenge our current understanding, that reveal even greater complexity than we currently imagine. But even now, with our incomplete knowledge, we can appreciate the fundamental insight. Trees are not isolated. They are connected. They communicate. And in their communication, in their sharing and warning and mutual support, they create something larger than themselves. They create forests. This matters practically for conservation and land management. But it also matters philosophically, perhaps even spiritually. It offers a different model for thinking about life, about community, about strength. In human societies, we often valorize independence, self-reliance, individual achievement. These have their place. But the trees remind us that there's another path, one based on interdependence, on pooling resources, on collective resilience. The strongest trees are not the ones that grow in isolation, hoarding all the sunlight and water for themselves. The strongest trees are the ones most deeply connected. The mother trees, with their extensive fungal partnerships, the hubs in the network. Their strength comes not from taking, but from giving, from supporting others who then support them in turn. It's not altruism, not in the way we use that word. It's more fundamental than that. It's an understanding, encoded in chemistry and structure, that individual survival is tied to community health. That when you support the forest supports you. We might learn from this. As we face our own challenges, climate change, resource scarcity, social fragmentation, the trees offer a model. Not a prescription, they're trees, not moral guides, but an example. A demonstration that complex, resilient systems can emerge from simple principles of connection and reciprocity. When you walk through a forest now, perhaps you'll sense it differently. The quiet beneath the canopy isn't emptiness, it's a kind of fullness, a space rich with invisible communication. Beneath your feet, resources are flowing through fungal networks. Chemical messages are passing from root to root. Electrical signals are pulsing through the mycelium. And perhaps, in frequencies you can't hear, the trees are speaking, in clicks and vibrations, in a language older than words. You're walking not through a collection of separate organisms, but through a community, a network, a system engaged in constant conversation. The trees around you are aware in their own way. They're sensing light and temperature and moisture. They're detecting threats and opportunities. They're adjusting their growth, their chemistry, their behavior, based on signals from their environment and from each other. It's a humbling thought. We've built complex civilizations, developed language and technology, shaped the planet. And yet trees, rooted in place, apparently simple, have been engaging in sophisticated communication for millions of years, creating networks of mutual support that span forests and continents. They don't have brains, don't have consciousness as we understand it, but they have something, some capacity to sense, to respond, to interact in ways that serve not just individual survival, but collective flourishing. Some wisdom, if we can call it that, encoded not in neural tissue, but in chemical pathways and fungal partnerships. Perhaps wisdom isn't about thought at all, but about relationship, about being attuned to your environment, about giving and receiving in sustainable balance, about creating systems where individual success contributes to, rather than competing with, community health. These are lessons we might do well to learn, or perhaps remember. Our own ancestors knew this once, understood themselves as part of larger systems, embedded in communities and ecosystems. Modern life has encouraged us to forget, to see ourselves as separate, as individuals maximizing our own outcomes regardless of impact on the whole. But we're not separate. We're connected to each other, to the ecosystems we inhabit, to the planet itself. Like the trees, our survival depends on the health of the systems we're part of. Like the trees, we're stronger when we support each other. The networks exist. We just need to tend them. There's one more aspect of tree communication worth contemplating, something that brings us full circle to where we began. It concerns endings and what happens when trees reach the end of their lives. Trees can live an extraordinarily long time. Oaks and beeches regularly reach several hundred years. Giant sequoias can live for thousands of years, witnessing the rise and decline of human civilizations, standing as living bridges between past and future. But even the longest-lived trees eventually face their end. Age, disease, storm damage, fire, human activity. There are many ways a tree's life can conclude. And as that end approaches, something remarkable often happens. The tree begins to give away its resources. Not slowly, not grudgingly, but in a kind of final generosity. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, accumulated over a lifetime, flow out through the mycorrhizal network to surrounding trees. It's as if the tree, sensing its own decline, chooses to invest in the forest's future rather than clinging to resources it can no longer use effectively. This behavior has been observed in multiple species and multiple forests. It's not universal, not every tree does this, but it happens often enough to suggest it's a real phenomenon, not just coincidence. The mechanisms aren't fully understood. Perhaps it's a passive process, resources simply flowing from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, as the tree's ability to regulate its internal chemistry weakens. Perhaps it's more active than that, triggered by stress signals that prompt the tree to export rather than hoard. Either way, the effect is the same. The nutrients that sustained that tree's growth, sometimes for centuries, return to the forest community. They nourish young trees, help struggling neighbors, enrich the soil. The tree's final act is one of contribution. And even after the tree ends, even after it topples in a storm or succumbs to disease, its role in the forest isn't over. The trunk becomes habitat for insects and fungi. Birds nest in cavities. Small mammals shelter in hollow spaces. As the wood decays, it slowly releases nutrients back into the soil, feeding new growth. A fallen log in a forest can support an entire ecosystem, dozens of species making their homes in the slowly decomposing wood. In temperate rainforests, these nurse logs are crucial for forest regeneration. Seedlings take root in the nutrient-rich, moisture-retaining wood, growing directly from the body of the fallen tree. The old tree quite literally becomes the foundation for new life. There's something profound in this, a reminder that endings and beginnings are not separate but intertwined. That what we think of as an individual organism is really a temporary configuration of matter and energy, borrowed from the environment and eventually returned. That the boundary between self and other, between individual and ecosystem, is permeable, provisional, constantly being crossed. The tree that stood for 300 years was never truly separate from the forest. It drew its substance from the soil, from the air, from sunlight. It exchanged constantly with other trees, with fungi, with bacteria and insects and birds. It was a node in a network, a participant in countless relationships. And when it could no longer maintain the particular form we recognize as a living tree, when the chemical reactions that sustained its life slowed and stopped, the matter that made up that tree didn't disappear. It transformed, became food for decomposers, became soil, became nutrients taken up by new trees, became, in a very real sense, part of new trees. The forest persists, not despite the fact that individual trees pass on, but because of it. The cycling of matter and energy, the constant transformation from one form to another, this is what sustains the system. Old trees must eventually make room for new ones, but they do so in a way that enriches rather than diminishes the whole. It's a model of mortality we might find comforting if we let ourselves sit with it, not as an escape from our own endings, but as a reminder that life is larger than any individual life. That what we build, what we create, what we contribute, these things persist and transform and become part of what comes after. The trees we plant today will stand long after we're gone. The forests we protect, the networks we help restore, these will support life we'll never see. And the choices we make now, about how we relate to each other and to the natural world, these choices ripple forward in time, shaping the possibilities available to those who come after. In this way, we're not so different from trees. We're part of systems larger than ourselves. Our actions affect others. Our strength comes from connection. And our legacies lie not in what we accumulate, but in what we give, what we contribute to the health and flourishing of the community and ecosystem we're part of. The trees have been showing us this all along. Through their underground networks, their chemical conversations, their seasonal rhythms, their mutual support, and their final generosity, they demonstrate a way of being that transcends individual survival. They teach us, if we're willing to learn, about resilience and community and connection. They teach us that survival is not a solo endeavor, but a collective one. That the strongest communities are those where resources flow to where they're needed, where information is shared, where support is given and received. That what looks like competition from the outside is often cooperation from within. That you don't have to be the biggest or the fastest to thrive. You just have to be connected. As we face the challenges ahead, climate change and ecosystem disruption, and all the uncertainty of a rapidly changing world, we might do well to remember the forests. To remember that resilience comes from diversity and connection. That systems with strong networks can withstand shocks that would shatter isolated individuals. That investing in community health is investing in your own survival. The mycorrhizal networks beneath the forest floor have existed for hundreds of millions of years, since plants first colonized land. They've survived mass extinctions, ice ages, continental drift. They've adapted to countless changes, persisted through catastrophes that eliminated most of the species alive at the time. They've done this not through dominance, but through cooperation, not through rigid structures, but through flexible networks, not through individual strength, but through collective resilience. We have networks too, social networks, economic networks, ecological networks that connect us to the living world. The question is whether we'll tend these networks, whether we'll recognize their importance, whether we'll choose connection over isolation, reciprocity over exploitation, long-term health over short-term gain. The trees can't tell us what to do. They have no advice to offer, no wisdom to impart in words. But they can show us what works, what has worked for millions of years, what allows complex systems to persist and adapt and thrive in changing conditions. They show us that communication matters, that paying attention to your neighbors, sending warnings, offering support, these things enhance everyone's chances of survival, including your own. That there's strength in diversity, safety in redundancy, power in connection. And perhaps most importantly, they show us that we're part of something larger, that the illusion of separation is just that, an illusion, that we exist within networks, depend on them, contribute to them, whether we acknowledge it or not. The difference between acknowledging and ignoring this reality is the difference between working with these systems and against them, between enhancing network health and degrading it, between creating conditions for mutual flourishing and undermining the very systems our survival depends on. When we protect forests, we're not just saving trees. We're protecting networks, relationships, communities. We're preserving systems that have intrinsic value, that support countless forms of life, that provide services we depend on but rarely think about. Air purification, water filtration, climate regulation, soil building, carbon storage. And we're protecting something else too, a model, an example, a reminder that there are different ways to be successful, different strategies for thriving, different measures of strength than the ones our culture typically values. The trees will continue their conversations with or without us. The mycorrhizal networks will persist in whatever forests remain. The chemical signals will pass from root to root. The electrical impulses will travel through fungal hyphae. The seasonal rhythms will continue their ancient patterns. But whether we're part of that, whether we exist in relationship with these systems or destroy them, that's up to us. That's a choice we're making right now, in how we treat forests, how we think about land use, how we respond to climate change, how we structure our economies and societies. The trees are showing us a path, not the only path, but one that works, that has worked for a very long time. A path based on connection, reciprocity, on supporting the community that supports you. Perhaps it's time we walked that path. Perhaps it's time we learned to speak the language of the forest, not with words, but with actions. With how we treat the land, how we relate to other species, how we build our communities, how we think about strength and success, and what it means to flourish. The conversation is happening all around us. The question is whether we'll listen, whether we'll join in, whether we'll add our voices to the ancient dialogue of the living world. The forest is speaking. It has been all along. Under the soil, through the fungi, in the flow of nutrients and the exchange of signals, in the support flowing from old trees to young ones, in the collective resilience that emerges from countless individual connections. It's speaking in a language older than words, more fundamental than human speech, a language of relationship and reciprocity, of giving and receiving, of being part of something larger than yourself. And if we're very quiet, if we stop and listen, really listen, we might just hear it. We might understand, in some deep and wordless way, what the trees have been trying to tell us all along. That we are not alone, that we are connected, that we are part of this ancient conversation, and that our survival, like theirs, depends on maintaining these connections, tending these relationships, honoring these networks that sustain all life. The trees are talking. They're talking to each other, and in their own way, they're talking to us, showing us how to live in community, how to build resilience, how to create systems that support life, not just for today, but for centuries to come. All we have to do is listen, to pay attention, to learn, and then to act on what we've learned, building human systems that work with nature's networks rather than against them, that enhance connection rather than severing it, that support life in all its forms. The conversation continues. It will continue long after this video ends, long after you fall asleep tonight, long after any of us individually are here to witness it. The trees will keep talking, the networks will keep functioning, the forest will keep being forest. And perhaps that's the most comforting thought of all. That this ancient system, this web of life and communication and mutual support, is larger and older and more resilient than any of the challenges we face. That even if we fail, even if we don't learn these lessons in time, the trees will persist somewhere, the fungi will survive, the networks will eventually regrow. But how much better if we don't have to test that resilience? How much better if we learn now, while there's still time, while forests still cover much of the earth, while the networks are still largely intact? How much better if we become partners in this conversation, rather than disruptors of it? The trees are waiting, the forest is listening, the networks are here, ready to include us if we're willing to be included. All we have to do is step into the forest, put our hands on the bark, feel the life thrumming beneath our fingers, and remember. Remember that we're part of this, part of the web, part of the network, part of the conversation that sustains all life on Earth. The trees are talking, they've always been talking, and now, finally, we're beginning to understand what they're saying. Thank you for listening, for walking with me through this forest of ideas and discoveries. Whether you're still awake, mind buzzing with thoughts about underground networks and chemical conversations, or whether you've already slipped into dreams, I hope this journey has given you something. A sense of wonder, perhaps. A feeling of connection. A reminder that the world is larger and stranger and more beautiful than we often remember. You've done enough thinking for today. You've traveled deep into the soil, traced the paths of fungal threads, followed the flow of nutrients from tree to tree. You've learned about warnings and signals, about mothers and children in the forest, about communities that persist for centuries through connection and care. Now it's time to rest, to let these ideas settle, the way fallen leaves settle on the forest floor, slowly becoming part of something larger. To release the need to understand everything, to hold every detail. The forest doesn't ask you to remember it all. It asks only that you felt it, that you sensed, for a moment, the great web of relationship that holds all things. Close your eyes, if they're not closed already. Feel the weight of your body, held by the earth just as the trees are held. Feel your breath, steady and slow, like sap rising in spring. Feel yourself connected to everything around you, part of countless invisible networks, supported and supporting, giving and receiving. Alive in this moment, and part of a story that's been unfolding for billions of years. You are enough. You have done enough. The trees don't ask for perfection. They simply grow, day by day, season by season, reaching for light while staying rooted in darkness, connected to their community while remaining themselves. You can be like that too, rooted and reaching, connected and individual, part of the network and complete in yourself. Let go now. Let the thoughts drift away like seeds on the wind. Let your mind grow quiet, like a forest at dusk. Let yourself sink into rest, into stillness, into the deep and peaceful darkness where all growth begins. The trees will still be there in the morning, still talking, still sharing, still connected. The networks will still spread through the soil. The forest will still be forest. And you will still be you, rested and renewed, ready to grow toward your own light, supported by your own connections, part of your own beautiful, tangled, miraculous web of life. Sleep well, dream of forests, of roots and connection, of giving and receiving, of ancient conversations, continuing in the dark. You are part of the network. You are held. You are home. Good night.